200 years. It goes back to 1812 when the term gerrymandering was first invented. It was meant to poke fun at Elbridge Gerry, so it really should be gerrymandering. Elbridge Gerry, the governor of Massachusetts, who drew a salamander-shaped district up around Cape Ann, north of Boston, to benefit his party, and the newspaper called it the gerrymander, and ever since then, it's been a very controversial topic because it can have an impact on who wins and loses legislative elections, how competitive those legislative districts are, and that kind of thing. And so this would take away the ability for us to hold the people that do that drawing of lines accountable, right? The fact is that right now you've got a seven-member redistricting commission. It's the governor, the auditor, the secretary of state, 2 Republicans, 1 from the House and 1 from the Senate, and 2 Democrats, 1 from the House and 1 from the Senate. You know what the thing is about all 7 of those people that currently do that job? If you don't like the way they do that job, you can fire them, right? President Trump has a saying, if you can't fire somebody, they don't really work for you, right? If you can't fire the people that do these public jobs, then do they really work for you? I'd say no. So what issue 1 would do is put 15 unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats in charge of drawing the district lines. It's worse than that because then it gives them the job. It tells them that they must draw a certain number of Democrat districts and a certain number of Republican districts. What a very cynical way of viewing the world. They think that they get to pick the majorities in the House and the Senate. They think that they get to pick the majorities in the Ohio congressional delegation. So they're going to sit down and try to ram a square peg into a round hole and draw a certain number of districts based on this formula that they have. That's called gerrymandering. The Oxford English Dictionary definition of gerrymandering is when you draw political districts to achieve a specific partisan outcome. Folks, that's right there in the language of what issue 1 would do. It would require gerrymandering to reach a certain threshold of Democratic districts and a certain threshold of Republican districts. It goes beyond that. There's no accountability for keeping communities whole, abiding by communities of interest. There's nothing in there about compactness. You want to see some really funky snake-shaped districts and that kind of thing, issue 1 would cause that, right? Because in order to draw the certain number of Democratic districts they want to get to, they're going to have to really sort of bastardize the shape of these districts and create some really funky looking things on the map to get to that specific political outcome. Here's another thing, and this is probably a First Amendment violation. If issue 1 passes, you literally are not allowed to talk to members of the new redistricting commission. If one of them if one of them goes to your church, if one of them has a kid that plays soccer on the soccer field with your kid, you can't walk up to them and talk to them about redistricting. That's crazy. You're literally only allowed to talk to them about redistricting at a publicly announced redistricting meeting. So this would say that you lose the right to walk up to somebody and talk to them about a public job that they're being paid with your taxpayer dollars to do. That's pretty wild. One of the other things to know about issue 1 is that it will predictably reduce minority representation. Folks, you don't need to guess about this. This happened in Michigan. In 2018, they passed something almost exactly like what is now on Ohio's ballot as issue 1. And what it required them to do is create this nonpartisan commission to draw district lines. So fast forward to 2021, Michigan draws new district lines under this new scheme. The city of Detroit is a 76% African American city, vastly minority city, right? In the city of Detroit, there are currently 0 African American members of Congress. Folks, that's unheard of. For 80 years, Detroit has had at least 1 black member of Congress. Today they have none. Why is that? Because they cracked the population. They would grab 20% here and then draw it all the way out into the suburbs. They would grab 20% here and draw it all the way out into the suburbs. And so by cracking these urban populations, they intentionally created a certain number of Democratic districts by reducing minority representation. That's a problem, and that would happen here in Ohio as well. And so that's something else to be concerned about. Here's something else. If you look at who's paying for issue 1, that tells you a lot. They've raised over $26 million. 85% of those dollars come from out of state. 85% comes from California, New York, Washington, D.C. There's also included in that, we believe, up to $6 million from a Swiss billionaire. literally from the country of Switzerland, like the people that give you the little red pocket knives and the mountain horns and the big pots of fondue. Like a guy in Switzerland who's a billionaire is trying to fund the Yes on Issue 1 campaign. Issue 1 is 13,000 words long. When you go to your voting location, you'll see a huge poster on the wall that we're required by law to post. It's the size of a bed sheet. It's huge. 13,000, if you want to go up and read it, step out of line so you're not holding everybody else up and read all 13,000 words of this amendment. Folks, the entire U.S. Constitution, does anybody know how long the entire U.S. Constitution is?
Less.
7,500 words. Good job, Bessie. You should be a state senator. 7,500 words in the U.S. Constitution. Issue 1 by itself is almost twice as long as the entire U.S. Constitution, and that would just be adding to the already 70,000 word long Ohio Constitution. So it's enormously complex. Here's something else you can point people to. When we wrote the ballot language, we were very truthful. Brutally honest, quite honestly, so much so that the leftists funding this thing lost their minds and they were really unhappy about it because we laid out exactly what it does. It puts a bunch of unelected, unaccountable people in charge. It takes away your ability to talk to these public officials. It requires gerrymandering. It undoes the protections against gerrymandering that Ohioans voted on in the last decade. And so we put all that right in the ballot language. They fought me and we won. The Ohio Supreme Court upheld our language because it is truthful. It is brutally honest about what Issue 1 does. And so when voters see that on the ballot, hopefully they recognize what a dangerous thing this is for Ohio. If people want to look at that ballot language and the arguments for and against Issue 1, that's required by law to be posted on my website, voteohio.gov. Anybody that wants to can go there. If you have a friend that wants to do their own research, they can see the full ballot language, they can see the full amendment language, and they can see the arguments for and against. And so it's important to talk to your friends about Issue 1 and why it's so crucial that they vote no on Issue 1. And don't leave it blank. Don't just go vote for President Trump and Bernie Moreno and maybe Bessa and our local candidates and then just leave the rest of the ballot blank. They got to go all the way to the end where they find Issue 1 and they've got to vote no on Issue 1. And the encouragement from a friend like you could really make the difference on that. So I want to make sure to leave time for questions, and then I know that our next state senator, Bessa Scher, is going to be up after me. Who's got questions? Yes, ma'am.
Why did me?
Yeah,
Why
absolutely.
didn't Maureen O'Connor? Why was she backing this? She's Republican, isn't she?
What?
She is not a Republican anymore. She used to be a Republican.
Really?
And
Rhino.
she is, well, she may still call herself a Republican. In my mind, she's not a Republican in good standing and hasn't been for a long time.
So is she a registered Democrat now, you were saying?
I don't know what, I've not looked up her party registration, but I know that if she voted in a Republican primary, she may technically be a Republican, but she's certainly not acting like one. And as Chief Justice of the Ohio Supreme Court, she didn't act like one either. She was very happy to use the party to get herself elected to lieutenant governor and to get herself elected to various judgeships and eventually to the Ohio Supreme Court, but she hasn't been acting like a Republican for a long time.
I didn't know that.
She's had a bone to pick about this going way back. Remember when the Ohio Supreme Court had a very narrow Republican majority last cycle? She was the one that led the charge, partnering with the Democrats to strike down our district lines over and over again because she had a fixation on this. And thankfully, once the federal courts intervened, they said, no, those district lines can stand. Yes, sir.
Is it true that this committee that selects would be for life?
Not for life, but they can't be fired. So they would be for that decade, right? So the first thing is, if this passes, it would immediately require the redrawing next year. So that's confusing. That's called mid-decennial redistricting. Normally, redistricting only happens every 10 years, right? On years that end in 0, we count the heads, we have a census, right? Every 10 years we have a census. And on years that end in 1, after the census is done, we traditionally draw lines. It's been that way forever. This would require mid-decennial redistricting. In 2025, they would redraw all the lines for congressional districts, for state senate districts. They'd probably try to get rid of her once she wins this state senate seat, right? Because they're threatened by a smart, powerful Republican woman like this with who immigrated legally to this country. They would want to get rid of Bessa for sure, right? And so they would redraw the district lines in 2025. And then and then their term would end, and then in 2031, the next time redistricting comes up, they would appoint a new group of redistricting commission members. Once their work of drawing district lines is done, the commission goes away. In 2041, they would appoint a new group. But you're right to say they can't be fired. Even if they commit a felony, even if they engage in some sort of criminal activity, they can't be fired. The only way to remove somebody from the redistricting commission is to get a vote of the other members of the commission to remove them. There's no other way to remove them, which is pretty wild as well.
You said
Yes, sir.
they appoint them. Who's they? How do they?
Yeah. So if you want to see